Hey squids, here I am. I'm working on my V-Strom 650. I'm building some things, and while I was riding it just yesterday, I thought to myself, man, bikes are just getting bigger and bigger every day, and this 650, every time I get on it, it just feels so perfect. The engine size is perfect. The V-twin is such a good streetable motor that I wonder, why does anybody need a 1000cc bike? And I've had many 1000s before, and I'm a fan of the power. I've had R1, GSX-R 1000s, etc., etc. And I really enjoy the power. But adventure bikes getting big, I have to question that a little bit. Because when you ride off-road, the weight of these bikes is much more magnified, and it seems like people are just getting out of control with the bike selection that they're picking. You know, I always give an example of a BMW GS, and there's a lot of guys that can really ride those bikes well, even though they're really big pigs. And those bikes are fantastic if they're working properly. But off-road, it takes a very skilled rider to ride off-road well. And any average Joe can ride a adventure bike, 1000cc on the street, and ride it without any problems. But the problem is, when you get off-road, the weight of bikes, it feels much more magnified. And I wonder why we're just getting carried away with heavy bikes and overly powerful bikes. Even though they have modes to adjust, it just seems a little bit too much. It used to be, a while ago, about 10 years ago, people saw this trend. Makers started making motorcycles like really large, 1300 cc's, and everybody was getting carried away with power. And then they started making small bikes, and all of these advanced riders, they were like, yeah, small bikes, that's the way to go. So they made like a Ninja 250, and everybody loved the redesign of the 250. People really enjoyed these small bikes for what they were. And nowadays, it's very hard to get a very light bike. And this V-Strom weighs 500 pounds, so it's not a very lightweight bike, but when you consider like a GS or any other bike, they weigh much more. And do you really need a big bike when you're doing adventures? And I think the answer is no. It actually hurts you to have a big bike because it limits you a whole lot more. Especially if you're an average rider. You're not going to be riding like the photos you see on catalogs of BMW, KTM. Those guys are advanced riders, and an advanced rider could ride a moped much better than I could on this. It really depends. But given the weight of a bike is so important, we're just getting carried away with the weight and the displacement of engines. Every time I look at bikes I would like to get, after this bike, I was looking at the Yamaha Tenere 1200, and I don't see the point of buying anything over 1000 cc's or even like 650. I wish that Suzuki did make some good upgrades, not just stylish upgrades. The new V-Strom 650 is not very good looking in my opinion, and it just doesn't appeal to me. This one is like a really good bargain, but there's many more upgrades, and when you compare it to the 1200 GS, it's like you're getting a much more powerful motor. But why? What's the purpose of getting a more powerful motor? It just doesn't seem appropriate for dual sporting. But unless you're just riding on the slab and you want the bike that revs lower, I guess you could get it. The one benefit I see with the 1200 Tenere is the shaft drive. I really wanted a bike with a shaft drive. But I also don't want, more weight, which is a given. But I wish they made a 650 shaft-driven adventure bike. And I know that a chain is better, it's more efficient and all of that, but I think for me, I just hate to do like chain stuff because I've ridden across the United States many times, and every time I go, I need a new chain because I do more than 15,000 miles. And it puts you in a place that you're not you don't know where the shops are. The last time I needed a chain, I really needed a chain, and it ended up being like in the middle of Oklahoma, and I had to drop everything that I was doing to go get a chain put on. And normally it's a very inexpensive, mod. You can do it yourself in a couple of hours, but I didn't have the tools on tour because it's not something that you want to change while on tour. That is why the shaft drive is really good for me, even though it's going to add some weight. 1000cc bikes, adventure bikes, dual sports, there's really no point. It's more of a limiting factor for riders these days. And it seems like there's a lot more ego attached to having like a large bike. People see big bikes as being the bike that they really desire and they want to keep for a very long time. But when you look at the build of this Suzuki V-Strom, it feels like a very substantial bike, and everybody that sees this bike goes like, man, that's a really big bike. And physically it is that big. It is a big bike. And motor-wise, I can't see myself wanting anything bigger than a 650. This thing does 110 miles an hour, and most of the time I'm not going to be driving or riding over 100 miles an hour anyway. It's not the style that I ride. I prefer the 0 to 60, which is a lot more fun. That's why dual sporting makes a whole lot more sense. The perfect dual sport for me is a little bit different. I like the 650s, but an XR 650R is really good. A DRZ 400 or a WR 450 that's been dual sported. Those make great dual sports, but the only issue is that if you have to ride to Utah from DC, you do not want to be on those thumpers. That's why you need to trailer it. But this thing, I can ride it to Utah, and I've done it. I've ridden to Utah a couple of times. And on the highway, that's why I like the V-Strom. It is just so good on the highway, and it's decent off-road. And I've gotten in trouble with people online before about riding this thing off-road. It's not a dual sport. Even though it looks like a dual sport, it's not really. It's got the 19-inch front wheel, which is good, but it just doesn't behave. The geometry of this bike is not that good for riding off-road. I know that there's riders out there that are much better than me and they would be able to ride it like crazy, but I'm also paranoid about dropping the bike. I don't want to drop it anywhere. I don't have a cell phone, so I couldn't call people to like help me out, or AAA. So for me, I like to ride it like I'm not going to drop it. And it makes a great bike. It just, I find it very difficult to believe that people are getting carried away with buying bikes that are so large, such large displacement. It used to be like 40 years ago, people, even in Europe, a 250 was a big bike. It was a very big bike for that time. And now we're just getting carried away with displacements going up. I think we need to kind of roll it back a little bit and start looking at smaller bikes, like the CB500X that I rode cross country. It's an almost perfect bike. It has everything that this one has, a little bit less comfort, and it's like a little bit less better for off-roading, even though the new ones might be better. I think a 500cc to 650 might be the perfect adventure bike. And oftentimes I look down a little bit on riders that get like GSs, because what I've seen these guys do is just get a very expensive bike for $20-something thousand, get all the gear, all the panniers, all the racks, all the protectors, and all they do is ride to Starbucks. So they're really posers, and there's a lot of adventure posers because the adventure market is red hot. But I've seen a lot of people being posers. For me, I would rather get like a cheap bike like the V-Strom 650 and use whatever money that I had left instead of purchasing a very expensive dull bike like a BMW GS, and use it for adventures. That's the whole purpose. The whole purpose is to get out there and ride. Well guys, that's me complaining about bikes getting a little bit too big. It's not a popular opinion, I guess, because the GS is one of the best selling bikes out there, the KTM Adventure and Africa Twin, and I would love to have one of those. It's just a 650. Every time I get on this bike, I'm like, this is such a good bike. It feels so good riding. The V-twin engine on this is excellent. It doesn't feel like it needs more power. It's a really odd thing. Like, this V-Strom is an amazing bike, and a bike that I've kept probably the longest I've had. And I've had many bikes. I've had over 30 bikes, and this thing is in my stable. All right, guys, thanks for watching. I will see you in the next video. Bye.